The darkest days in suburban New York. Sarah Miller had always imagined her life in suburban New York would be a picture of the American dream. She lived in a spacious, sunlit house on a quiet street in Yonkers, raising 2 young children with her husband Jack, a charismatic and successful real estate entrepreneur. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. Block parties in the summer, family barbecues in the backyard, and evenings spent watching the kids play in the cul-de-sac. But inside, cracks had started to form in the foundation of her marriage. The storm broke on an ordinary Thursday. Sarah accidentally found a text message on Jack's phone, a message that wasn't meant for her, overflowing with intimate words and hidden promises. The sender was Emily, Sarah's closest friend since college. Someone she trusted more like a sister than a friend. At first, Sarah tried to rationalize what she saw. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a bad joke, but the truth hit her harder than she ever expected. Her husband and her best friend were having an affair, and they hadn't even tried to hide it very well. After the confrontation, things deteriorated rapidly. In a cold and calculated move, Jack and Emily confronted Sarah with what felt like rehearsed indifference. They told her she no longer belonged in the house, even though, legally, her name was on the deed. Sarah couldn't believe she was being pushed out of her own home, the place she had poured her heart and soul into, decorating every corner, painting the walls with her children's laughter. She watched as Jack, once gentle and loving, transformed into someone she barely recognized. Distant, unyielding, all business. Emily, too, acted like a stranger, wielding betrayal like a weapon, with nowhere else to turn and stunned by the suddenness of her circumstances. Sarah packed her belongings in cardboard boxes, each item a small reminder of the family life she'd lost. On her last night in the Yonkers house, she walked through each empty room in silence. She let her fingers graze the door frames where she'd measured her children's growth, traced over the patterns in the kitchen tiles she'd lovingly chosen, and stood quietly in the backyard beneath the maple tree where they'd hung Christmas lights every year. As the darkness pressed in, Sarah felt alone in a way she never had before. A foreigner in her own life. The suburban streets, once symbols of security and hope, now seemed cold and unfamiliar, echoing her own sense of displacement and heartbreak. Those first days and nights after leaving were a blur, filled with exhaustion and disbelief. Sarah's world had been upended by the 2 people she had trusted most. But in that darkness, something quietly settled inside her. A fragile but persistent determination not to let their betrayal define the rest of her life. Shock and isolation. When Sarah finally left the Yonkers house, it was like stepping out of a familiar movie into a world of uncertainty. She moved into a modest, cramped apartment in Brooklyn, a far cry from the comfort and stability she'd known. The neighborhood was loud and restless. Sirens and car horns replaced the laughter of children and the hush of suburban evenings. It all felt temporary, as though she were living in someone else's borrowed life. The shock of betrayal didn't fade with distance. If anything, the pain grew sharper, cutting deeper each night she spent alone. Sarah's phone, once alive with messages from friends, now mostly buzzed with routine reminders and work emails. Old acquaintances grew distant, unsure how to approach her. Others sided with Jack, drawn in by his status and charisma. Even family members seemed awkward, offering kind words, but keeping their distance as if her misfortune were contagious. Emily's absence was another wound. Sarah sometimes caught herself reaching for her phone to call her friend before remembering, with fresh heartbreak, what had happened. Juggling work in a midtown office while raising 2 children suddenly became an immense challenge. Every morning, she forced herself to wake with the alarm, pushed through her exhaustion, dressed the kids, packed lunches, and tried to keep a brave face. The office felt both like a refuge and a prison. Colleagues whispered out of earshot, and Sarah endured polite small talk while fighting the urge to break down. She would come home most evenings drained, and the silence of the apartment stood as a stark reminder of all she'd lost. Nights were the hardest. After reading bedtime stories and tucking in her children, Sarah would lie awake in the dark, wrestling with an ache that refused to go away. Tears came easily, along with feelings of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. How could the people she loved most both betray and abandon her so easily? Sometimes shame crept in. Maybe she'd missed warning signs. Maybe she wasn't good enough. Loneliness closed in like winter, making each day feel even heavier. Social media made things worse. Posts and photos of Jack and Emily circulated, showing them as a glamorous, happy couple at local charity galas and community events. Comments poured in, praising Jack for moving on, while others blamed or pitied Sarah in equal measure. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. The city outside her window was vibrant and full of promise, but inside, Sarah felt invisible, forgotten by the very world that once embraced her. Despite everything, she clung fiercely to the routines she could control, making meals, helping with homework, tidying the apartment to create a sense of order. Slowly, beneath the surface, a quiet resolve began to form. Sarah realized that if she was to survive this chapter of her life, she could only rely on herself. Still, in those early weeks, heartbreak and loneliness were her constant companions, shadows that trailed her through every sleepless night and uncertain dawn. Glimmer of light. Sarah Miller had always believed that no matter how dark life became, there would come a moment, a glimmer of hope, that could help her find her way. In the weeks following her world-shattering separation, Sarah's days passed in a haze of sorrow and survival. She stuck to routines out of sheer necessity, forcing herself through each workday, collecting her children from school, cooking dinners she barely tasted, and lying awake most nights, lost in the ache of betrayal. But grief and loneliness did not dull her mind forever. In fact, beneath the pain, something resolute began to grow. She started looking for answers, small fragments of control, in a world that had spun off its axis. It began with an envelope, innocently wedged amidst overdue bills and advertising mailers on the chipped kitchen counter of her Brooklyn apartment. Sarah had nearly tossed it into the recycling when the return address caught her eye, a name she'd seen only in passing, on a real estate transfer form Jack had shown her months ago. Curiosity piqued. Sarah opened it and found a notice regarding a property mortgage payment on a unit she'd never heard of. Her first instinct was to text Jack and ask, but muscle memory stopped her thumb mid-air. She set the envelope aside, but felt a prickling unease the rest of the evening. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed other inexplicable things: bank statements with odd withdrawals, transactions she didn't recall authorizing, and an email confirming a new account Jack had never mentioned. Little questions began pinging inside her mind, growing louder as she reviewed her own documents. Why would Jack need a second mortgage? Where was he suddenly investing their money? And why had he grown so evasive about discussing their finances in the last year of their marriage? She remembered the hush in the kitchen when she'd once asked about a missing tax document, Jack's sudden irritation, and the way Emily had always changed the subject. As these suspicions bloomed, the fog of grief began to thin, replaced by a sharper, more urgent focus. Sarah realized with a jolt that Jack, ever the savvy businessman, might be manipulating or hiding their marital assets while pushing through the divorce. The betrayal was more than emotional. It could become financial devastation as well. She thought of her children's future, of her own hard work poured into their home, and felt something old and powerful awaken, a need to fight back. But fighting back required information, hard evidence, not just hunches. Sarah began by compiling all their financial records, sifting through years of joint bank accounts, mortgage documents, and tax returns. She created color-coded spreadsheets late into the night, sorting deposits and withdrawals, tracing where the money flowed. Some nights, she sat at the rickety kitchen table, eyes gritty with exhaustion. But her determination grew with every new irregularity she uncovered. Still, Sarah knew she was outmatched in the world of high-stakes finances and legal games. Swallowing her pride, she reached out to an old college friend, Rachel, who now worked in tech consulting and owed Sarah a few favors from their undergraduate days. Over coffee in a crowded Midtown cafe, Sarah confessed her suspicions in a trembling voice. Rachel listened intently and promised to help, explaining the basics of forensic accounting and how to discreetly obtain further information. With Rachel's guidance, Sarah learned how to request her marital tax returns directly from the IRS and how to check property records online for any holdings associated with Jack's name. She paid close attention to the digital messages Jack still sent her, formal, clipped, and often about logistics with the children, and made notes whenever anything sounded odd or coded. Eventually, she even bought a simple voice recorder, keeping it tucked in her purse in case future conversations with Jack veered into financial matters. The idea was not to trap him, but to have backup if she needed to prove what money legitimately belonged to her and her children. The nights and weekends were harder. Sarah often worried that she was imagining things, that grief and anger were making her paranoid. She felt guilty for snooping, for becoming the sort of woman who didn't trust her own husband, even though he had given her every reason not to. But each new discovery, each piece of paperwork, each line on a spreadsheet, gave her strength and purpose. She came to understand that for years, Jack had meticulously planned much of their financial life without her full consent. He'd opened accounts in his name only, moved money using companies she'd never heard of, and structured investments so they appeared separate from the marriage. Sarah no longer saw herself as just a victim. She was now an investigator, taking control of her own story. As weeks passed, Sarah began to see patterns. She found a sequence of wire transfers that sent thousands of dollars to a holding company registered in Delaware. She traced the paper trail from their home's equity line of credit to a suspicious renovation project that had never been completed. She even discovered Jack had quietly transferred the title of a car, ostensibly for business, out of both their names, a move that would further diminish the assets considered common property under New York's divorce laws. All the while, Sarah maintained a calm facade for her children, making sure their lives remained as stable as possible. If she felt guilt or fear, she didn't show it at work or at home. She knew she had to be both mother and detective. There were moments when she broke down in private, overwhelmed, not just by the mountain of betrayal, but by the institutional hurdles facing any woman fighting a powerful man in court. Still, step by step, she built her case. Eventually, there was enough evidence to bring to a lawyer, someone experienced in high-conflict divorces and asset protection. Sarah carefully organized the files, printouts, and recordings she'd collected. For the first time since leaving her Yonkers home, she felt a cautious sense of agency. Walking into the attorney's office, she realized that her struggle was no longer just to survive emotionally. It was a fight for justice, for her children's well-being, for respect, and for the security she deserved after years of partnership. That sense of hope, though fragile, became Sarah's anchor. It kept her steady during moments of self-doubt, during tiring legal consultations, and on the long subway rides back to Brooklyn after meetings with her lawyer. She began to see possibilities where before there had only been regret. The apartment that had once felt like a prison now served as her war room, a space for planning, gathering strength, and reclaiming her future. Sarah's story, once one of heartbreak and marginalization, slowly transformed into one of quiet power. The glimmer of light was not just the prospect of winning back her share of the family's assets, but the realization that even after the deepest betrayal, she was capable of protecting herself and her children, and of rewriting her story on her own terms. The secret plan, Sarah's transition from overwhelmed and betrayed wife to determined investigator, had begun with small steps: late nights studying financial statements, quiet conversations over coffee, and moments of doubt replaced by growing resolve. But as her suspicions about Jack's financial misdeeds sharpened, Sarah realized that if she wanted justice for herself and her children, collecting ironclad evidence was not simply an option. It was a necessity. This realization marked the start of her secret plan, a concerted, methodical effort carried out under the radar, with every move shadowed by both hope and fear. To the outside world, Sarah appeared much the same, a hard-working, quietly resilient single mom doing her best to rebuild in Brooklyn. She kept her head down at work, maintained a steady routine with her children, and avoided any social confrontations that could give Jack or Emily even a hint that she was up to something. Beneath this calm surface, however, her mind was always in motion, piecing together the clues she'd found and mapping out her next steps like a chess player several moves ahead. One of the first parts of the plan was to gather all available documentation of their marital assets. Jack, ever the showman, had consistently kept Sarah at arm's length from major financial decisions, couching his control in the language of taking care of the family. Sarah had access to some joint statements and a handful of mortgage records, but she suspected there were many more accounts, shell companies, and investments tucked away in his name alone. She decided to turn her biggest liability, her unfamiliarity with their finances, into an opportunity to learn and take charge. She began with the basics, digging up old tax returns, reviewing scanned documents and emails from the bank, and cross-referencing statements for inconsistencies. Each night, after the kids were asleep, Sarah spread stacks of paperwork and her aging laptop across the kitchen table, sometimes working until dawn. She color-coded files and flagged suspicious transactions, retracing the path of every dollar she could identify. In this painstaking work, Sarah discovered not only odd mortgage payments and unaccounted withdrawals, but the extent of Jack's financial web, a network far more complex than she ever imagined. Knowing she'd need expert help to follow the more technical trails, Sarah reached out to Rachel, her old college friend, who now worked in tech and accounting. Under the pretense of having coffee to catch up, Sarah shared her suspicions and the evidence she'd compiled so far. Rachel, familiar with both forensic accounting and the corporate games Jack played, offered both technical guidance and moral support. She taught Sarah how to request official records from government agencies without alerting Jack, and how to monitor changes in property deeds and business registrations online. Rachel even built a secure, encrypted shared folder for Sarah, ensuring that her files would be safe, even if Jack managed to get into her email or laptop. Armed with this new knowledge and her friend's help, Sarah sent requests to the IRS for copies of joint and business tax filings, records Jack had always filed alone. She spent evenings scouring New York's public property records and business directories, learning how to connect the dots between shell companies and real estate holdings. Each new search and each quiet breakthrough came with a mixture of adrenaline and anxiety. At every moment, Sarah worried Jack or his lawyers might catch on and lock everything down for good. As her cache of evidence grew, Sarah realized the importance of capturing not just digital trails, but also verbal admissions and behavioral patterns. Whenever Jack messaged or called to discuss logistics about their children or any other matter remotely related to money, Sarah listened closely, making detailed notes, and sometimes, when it was legal and appropriate, recording their conversations. She documented every interaction. Each time Jack stonewalled her questions about unpaid bills, every moment he dodged inquiries about missing funds, and every unusual withdrawal he couldn't explain. Jack, still convinced of his control and the power of his deception, paid little attention to Sarah's subtle probing. To him, she remained the naive spouse, overwhelmed by the realities of divorce in America. He spoke to her with formal detachment, often dismissing her concerns as irrelevant or beyond her understanding. Sarah responded with politeness, masking her growing confidence and keeping her cards carefully hidden. It wasn't just Rachel who helped. Sarah knew she needed legal backup, so she began quietly interviewing divorce attorneys recommended by support groups online and by a former neighbor. She put careful thought into these meetings, never divulging the full extent of her suspicions at first, but testing each lawyer's experience with high net worth, high conflict cases. When she finally selected an attorney, Ms. Saunders, she opened up about all she had discovered and shared her meticulously cataloged evidence. Ms. Saunders was both impressed and astonished by the complexity of Jack's schemes, and assured Sarah that much of what she'd found could be invaluable in court. Working with Ms. Saunders, Sarah fine-tuned her approach. They discussed legal strategies for preserving evidence and for obtaining further disclosures through official subpoenas, if necessary. Together, they built a timeline of suspicious activities, correlating financial records with Jack's travel, his business ventures, and even the timeline of his relationship with Emily. The case became more than a fight for Sarah's rights. It was about exposing Jack's willingness to betray and exploit the people closest to him for personal gain. Through all of this, Sarah never lost sight of her children's needs. She shielded them from the adult struggles swirling in the background, maintained consistency in their routines, and tried never to let her stress color the moments they shared. But as she quietly advanced her investigation, Sarah found that her children became her greatest source of motivation. Each time she wavered, their laughter, their trust, and even their sleepy questions about why Daddy wasn't home became fuel for her resolve. The secret plan was more nerve-wracking than Sarah ever imagined. There were hours when the risk seemed too great, when she imagined Jack finding out and turning the legal process against her. Sometimes she woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, unsure if she had the strength to see it through. But each day brought some small progress, another document secured, another gap in the financial puzzle filled. As months passed, Sarah's once chaotic file folders became a weapon, a comprehensive, well-documented narrative of deceit and misappropriation. With the help of her allies and the quiet discipline she cultivated in Brooklyn, Sarah slowly built a case that did not merely rely on allegations, but on hard evidence. Her secret plan had become her greatest hope. And although the coming courtroom battle would be public, her greatest triumph was reclaiming her agency, her dignity, and the future for which she and her children so desperately fought. Showdown in court. Sarah Miller never could have imagined what it would feel like to walk into a courtroom and face the two people who had turned her life upside down. On the morning of the trial, the air outside the Westchester County Courthouse was crisp and tense, the early sunlight glinting off glass and marble, illuminating the determined crowd of lawyers, litigants, and families waiting for justice. Sarah, gripping a worn folder packed with carefully cataloged evidence, stepped out of her attorney's car and took a long, steadying breath. Today, years of fear, doubt, and secret preparation would be tested not just before a judge, but in full view of Jack and Emily. The courthouse itself felt almost ceremonial, its tall columns and quiet hallways exuding both dignity and an undercurrent of anxiety. As Sarah entered the main lobby with her attorney, Ms. Saunders, she was acutely aware of every detail: the echo of footsteps, the murmur of distant voices, the scent of old wood and fresh coffee. After months of collecting receipts, emails, and financial records in the secrecy of her Brooklyn apartment, everything was about to be laid bare. The opposing side arrived minutes later, Jack in an expensive navy suit, his expression unreadable, flanked by his well-dressed legal team. Emily, dressed elegantly but avoiding Sarah's gaze, kept to Jack's side, hands folded tensely in her lap. Their attorney, renowned in local legal circles for his aggressive style, nodded curtly as he entered the courtroom. Though Sarah had rehearsed for this moment in her mind, the reality of seeing them, so composed, polished, and unapologetic, sent a jolt of anger through her. She steadied herself, remembering every night spent unraveling their secrets. The trial began with the formalities: introductions, procedural briefings, a review of submitted evidence. The judge, presiding over the case, was a seasoned woman with salt and pepper hair and sharp, patient eyes, rumored to have little patience for games or half-truths. As both sides delivered their opening statements, Sarah felt the weight of every person in that room: her children's future, her own dignity, and the silent hope of everyone who'd ever been wronged, resting on her shoulders. Jack's lawyers tried to paint a picture of stable, amicable separation. Their argument was that he had always been open with the family's finances, that any property transfers or large withdrawals were normal parts of doing business, and that Sarah, overwhelmed by the stress of divorce, was misinterpreting innocent facts. The rhetoric was slick, the tone condescending, and Jack himself nodded along as their story unfolded. But as Ms. Saunders rose to present Sarah's case, the energy in the courtroom began to shift. Calm and methodical, she laid out the timeline of suspicious activities: the discovery of unknown mortgage notices, sudden transfers out of joint accounts, evidence of shell companies created without Sarah's knowledge. Each exhibit was introduced with meticulous care: documents, bank statements, notarized letters, even property deeds. Sarah watched as the judge's eyebrows arched slightly at each new revelation, especially the chain of electronic transfers from their home equity line to a Delaware holding company. Ms. Saunders introduced expertly annotated spreadsheets summarizing more than $500,000 in marital assets Jack had tried to move out of reach. The backbone of the case lay in the documentation, and with each layer peeled back, Jack's confidence began to show small cracks. Perhaps the most damning moment came when Ms. Saunders played a brief, legally obtained audio recording, Jack, on speakerphone, confirming to Sarah that a recent property sale had been taken care of off the books, just like last time. The recording caught him off guard. His attorney objected, but the judge, after a brief review, allowed it into evidence. For the first time, Jack looked genuinely shaken. During cross-examination, Sarah had to recount how she'd been pushed out of her own home, denied access to information, and left scrambling to keep her family afloat, while Jack and Emily carried on publicly as a couple. Her voice was steady, sometimes trembling, but never faltering, as she described the sleepless nights, the fear of homelessness, and the shame of appearing powerless in front of her children. She detailed exactly how she'd uncovered each financial irregularity, her process of documentation, and the barriers she faced at every bureaucratic turn. The judge listened attentively, taking notes, occasionally pausing the proceedings to seek clarification. The defense tried to undermine Sarah's credibility, suggesting she was acting out of emotional distress or misunderstanding complex financial arrangements. But the well-organized proof, supported by Rachel's forensic reports and third-party confirmations, made their attempts feel hollow. Emily, when called to testify, looked increasingly uncomfortable under questioning. Asked directly if she was aware of any property or money transfers from the marriage, she hesitated, deflected, and at last admitted Jack handled those things, betraying the cracks in their united front. Witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors who had seen Sarah pack up her belongings in tears, accountants who'd been contacted for missing records, colleagues from Sarah's workplace who described her character and sudden, life-altering sense of displacement. Each testimony, small and large, built a picture not only of betrayal, but also of resilience and diligence in the face of overwhelming odds. As the final day of trial approached its close, Ms. Saunders delivered a closing argument that cut through every rationalization Jack's team had offered. She spoke directly to the judge's sense of fairness and the law's mandate to protect those wronged. This is not simply a case of marital breakdown, Your Honor. This is a case of premeditated financial deceit, a betrayal not only of trust, but of justice itself. My client has been denied her home, her dignity, and nearly her future by the duplicity of those she trusted most. The evidence, incontrovertible and overwhelming, demands a just restoration. Sarah sat in silence as Jack's legal team made their last stand, their voices sounding desperate and hollow after days of mounting proof. The judge took a brief recess, returning after what felt like an eternity. Her ruling was confident, clear, and uncompromising. She admonished Jack for deliberately attempting to subvert the division of marital property, ordered the immediate return of Sarah's share of assets, most notably the Yonkers family home, and restored primary custody of the children to her. The court found Jack's attempts at concealment egregious and awarded additional compensation for attorney's fees and emotional damages incurred through intentional deceit. The shock on Jack and Emily's faces was absolute. The courtroom, usually tense and procedural, was almost silent as the weight of the decision sank in. Sarah finally exhaled, tears pricking at her eyes, but not out of weakness for the first time in a long time, but relief and vindication. This victory was not just her own. It spoke for every quiet struggle, every sleepless night, and every ounce of courage summoned behind closed doors. As she stepped outside into the brisk late afternoon, the world seemed brighter. News spread quickly, not only among friends and neighbors, but also through local community groups
miss you
and
so
online
much.
circles of women facing similar battles. Sarah's victory became more than personal triumph. It became a symbol of what careful preparation, unwavering resolve, and just a glimmer of hope could achieve. Triumph and justice, the courtroom verdict felt surreal to Sarah. One moment she was sitting, shoulders tense, heart pounding, fearing the worst as the judge prepared to deliver the decision. The next, she was listening to sentences that would finally right years of wrongs. The restoration of her family home in Yonkers, the equitable division of marital assets, primary custody of her children, and explicit condemnation of Jack's deceit. In that instant, her world, shaken for so long by betrayal and struggle, began to realign. Tears stung Sarah's eyes as the realization dawned. She had won, but this victory was far bigger than just the return of tangible assets. It was justice, hard-fought and undeniable, delivered in full view of everyone who had doubted her. Jack and Emily, the architects of her suffering, had faced the scrutiny of the law and finally, the consequences of their actions. Sarah rose from her seat, hands trembling, head held high, and felt the quiet pride of someone who refused to be broken. The ripple of the verdict. Within days, news of the verdict coursed through the suburban communities surrounding New York City. The story was discussed at local coffee shops, in PTA meetings, and on neighborhood social media pages. For weeks, Sarah had been the subject of whispers and rumors. Some had pitied her, others had judged from afar. Now, her name became a symbol of resilience. Women she barely knew reached out to her, offering congratulations and sharing their own experiences. Sarah's ability to document, persevere, and stand strong against injustice resonated far beyond her circle. Emily and Jack did not escape unscathed. Many of the neighbors who once invited them to backyard parties now distanced themselves. Invitations dried up. Former friends and associates grew wary, their faith in Jack's trustworthiness eroding. Emily found herself the target of subtle but unmistakable censure in stores, at local charity events, and online. For Sarah, these moments weren't about revenge. Instead, they represented a long overdue shift. Those who violate the social fabric must answer not just legally, but morally, to their communities. A new stability at home, returning to the Yonkers house, was bittersweet for Sarah. The moving truck carried not just boxes and furniture, but the hope of a new beginning. She walked from room to room, reacquainting herself with the familiar creak of hardwood floors, the light slanting through bay windows, the garden that had grown wild in her absence. The echoes of old pain mingled with something new, relief, and the faint stirrings of happiness. With time and tender persistence, she began to transform the once tainted house into a home again. The children, too, felt the difference. The uncertainty that lingered throughout the ordeal slowly faded, replaced by routines they remembered, and the comforting structure Sarah could now provide. She celebrated small victories with them, baking cookies in the kitchen, planting flowers together in the yard, or simply sharing quiet evenings, reading by the fireplace. Gradually, laughter returned. Sarah marveled at her children's resilience. They were scarred, but not defined by what had happened. The inner journey toward healing. Winning in court had brought legal justice, but the emotional aftermath was more complex. Sarah found herself reflecting often on the darkness of the past years, scanning each memory for signs she should have seen, wondering whether she could ever fully trust again. She sought support in therapy and joined a support group for women rebuilding after devastating divorces. Among these women, Sarah discovered she was not alone. Each meeting was a step toward healing, sharing stories, exchanging advice, sometimes just sitting with others who understood profound loss. Sarah realized that, while she could never recapture her old innocence, she could build something better in its place: self-knowledge, strength, and boundaries that protected both her and her children. Her therapist helped her shed the residual guilt and shame, teaching her to recognize her survival as a triumph rather than a weakness. Friends, true ones, stood by her. New allies, drawn by her story, offered support and new beginnings. A voice for others. Sarah's case quietly became an inspiration. In legal aid, offices and shelters, counselors referenced her story as proof that careful preparation and courage could yield just outcomes. She agreed to be interviewed for a well-known women's magazine and shared her perspective, anonymized, on a podcast about divorce and starting over. Each time she spoke, her voice grew steadier. She emphasized the importance of documentation, the habit of asking hard questions, and the power of reclaiming one's narrative in the face of gaslighting and manipulation. Over time, Sarah began to advocate for improved legal protections for spouses facing coercion or shadowy financial dealings. She met with representatives of local family justice centers, offering to help design workshops for those feeling powerless or intimidated by the legal system. Her example illustrated how easily a trusted partner could abuse their position, and how crucial it was for women and men to remain involved in shared finances and to trust their instincts. Moments of peace, seeds of possibility. Despite the whirlwind of activity, Sarah found quiet satisfaction in simple moments. Gardening with her children, preparing her favorite meals, waking up in her own home with a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. She would sometimes stand by her bedroom window at night, looking at the neighborhood she loved, and let herself breathe deeply, grateful for the stability she had fought to regain. There were setbacks, of course, moments when painful memories surged, or when Jack tried, even in defeat, to undermine her confidence. But the old patterns no longer held sway. Each test was met with resolve, strengthened by the knowledge of what she had survived and achieved. Sarah's victory was never about causing Jack or Emily pain. It was, ultimately, about protecting herself and her children, and about proving to herself her own worth and competence. Justice, for her, meant more than getting back lost property. It meant reclaiming her dignity and clearing the path for a more hopeful future. A legacy renewed. As the seasons changed and the wounds of the past gradually healed, Sarah found herself dreaming again. She signed up for evening classes, explored career possibilities she had put on hold for years, and planned small adventures for her family: a road trip, a camping weekend, even a visit to see extended relatives.
I was at home.
Each plan
alone.
was a building block for the life she chose, no longer dictated by the expectations of others. Occasionally, Sarah would receive messages from strangers, women, sometimes men, who found courage in her story. She replied with honesty and kindness, offering what she had learned. You are stronger than you think. Keep the records, ask questions, find allies. You are not alone. Her story, once rooted in heartbreak and betrayal, had blossomed into one of hope, justice, and the quiet, persistent rebuilding of a life on her own terms. Triumph and justice weren't one-time events, Sarah realized. They were daily acts of will, compassion, and the unshakable belief that better days were possible and well-deserved. A new beginning in America. Sarah had once envisioned her move from Brooklyn back to Yonkers as the closing chapter in a long, harrowing novel, a simple return to what was lost. Instead, as she unpacked the last battered box in the sun-dappled foyer of her reclaimed house, she realized she stood on the threshold of something far greater, the start of a new life for herself and her children. The house, echoing with both painful memories and the promise of future laughter, became the unlikely stage for her American reinvention. Restoring home, rebuilding heart. The Yonkers home was more than bricks and windows. It was the physical foundation of Sarah's new beginning. Each room had absorbed the turmoil of recent years. Yet, as she swept dust from neglected corners and patched the faded walls, she felt a symbolic cleansing, too. She let her children choose colors for their rooms, painting over sadness with hopeful blues and cheerful yellows. They planted daffodils in the front yard, rooting themselves into the earth with every handful of rich soil. Never before had Sarah felt such a sense of ownership, not just of property, but of her direction in life. Some items Sarah left in boxes, not quite ready to face the emotions tied to them. But as she rearranged furniture and filled the empty bookcases, she added touches that were none of Jack's. The oversized reading chair by the window, fairy lights strung in her daughter's room, and a bulletin board near the kitchen where she pinned notes, positive affirmations, and her kids' artwork. This was her home now, shaped by her choices and filled with self-determination. Day-to-day courage. Sarah learned to savor everyday delights often taken for granted before. She created breakfast rituals, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, playful debates about cereal that grounded her children and herself before busy days. She discovered that the fastest way to rekindle their sense of belonging was through routine and shared experiences. Her mornings often began early, with the comforting thrum of the coffee maker and the gentle patter of children's feet in the hallway. She learned to multitask, checking emails for work, signing field trip permission slips, helping her son locate missing sneakers, while there were still moments of exhaustion and flashes of anxiety. Sarah noticed a new undercurrent of strength within herself, the certainty that she could handle whatever the day required. In the evenings, homework and dinner were followed by long walks through their quiet neighborhood. As leaves changed with the seasons, Sarah and her children traced the same sidewalks she once feared she'd never see again. These walks became conversations where laughter and honest questions replaced awkward silences. The neighborhood, once the backdrop to public humiliation and whispers, slowly morphed into a supportive landscape again.
Ma'am, could you step over here,
Neighbors
please?
she hadn't spoken to in months now greeted her warmly. Some, motivated by her perseverance, confessed their own struggles in private, reinforcing for Sarah the importance of solidarity and second chances. New friendships and support. A crucial part of Sarah's new start was rebuilding her circle of support. She formed stronger bonds with parents at the kids' school, joined a local book club, and accepted invitations she'd once politely declined out of loyalty to Jack. Over cups of coffee and neighborhood meetings, she realized how isolating her old life's perfectionism had been. Her vulnerability, once a source of shame, became the bridge to authentic relationships. Sarah's children, likewise, flourished in a new atmosphere of openness. They found comfort in old friendships and forged new ones, gradually feeling less defined by the drama of the past. Sarah encouraged them to try new activities: soccer and art for her daughter, science club for her son, quietly reassuring them that it was safe, even brave, to step forward. On particularly hard days, Sarah leaned into her online support network. Parenting forums, women's advocacy groups, and virtual therapy sessions became lifelines, offering practical advice and reminders that she was not alone. She also began volunteering at a local shelter, hoping to give back and help women who, like her, had found themselves uprooted by betrayal. Exploring dreams, deferred with survival, no longer her top priority. Sarah reflected on the dreams she had postponed for Jack's career and their family's routine. She realized that her journey could mean more than just stability. It could mean self-fulfillment. She signed up for evening business classes at a nearby college, undeterred by her age or the challenge of balancing single parenthood with homework. Each class expanded her sense of possibility as she imagined running her own company one day or stepping into a leadership role she'd previously thought out of reach. Sarah also nurtured her creative side, writing short essays about her experience and submitting them to online magazines. To her surprise, one was published, and she received a flurry of supportive comments and messages. Encouraged, she considered starting a blog to document her rebuilding journey, sharing both the setbacks and victories in hopes of inspiring others. Family, freedom, and forgiveness. Holidays and birthdays, once stressful battlegrounds, became opportunities for forging new traditions. The first Thanksgiving in their rebuilt home was simple, with mismatched dishes and a meal they cooked together. The kids made gratitude jars, and Sarah, exhausted but glowing with purpose, found herself thankful for the lessons hidden in adversity. Jack's presence never completely disappeared. There were legal and parental logistics to manage, and at times, old wounds were reopened. But Sarah learned to maintain firm boundaries, never letting old patterns dictate her new reality. She forgave herself for moments of doubt and for staying silent too long. With time, even her anger toward Jack and Emily softened, not into friendship or acceptance, but into the kind of quiet forgiveness that allowed her to move forward, unburdened. Looking ahead, Sarah's new beginning in America was not about perfection, but about forward motion. She celebrated small steps, the first family trip to the beach, an A on her daughter's spelling test, her own passing grade in a tough class. These moments were no longer overshadowed by fear or regret. As the months passed and the shadows of betrayal faded, Sarah often found herself awake late at night, not from anxiety but from excitement. She'd look out over the moonlit yard and think about the possibilities yet to come. Maybe a career change, maybe travels, maybe one distant day. The courage to try new love. Her greatest revelation was simple. Survival was never the end goal. Living authentically, with hope and self-respect, was her real victory. In each sunrise, in every opportunity to guide and love her children, Sarah discovered what it meant to truly begin again. Her life, once upended by loss and humiliation, had become a story of restoration, possibility, and personal agency. With each passing season, she wrote new chapters, not just for herself, but for her children, and for every woman who needed proof that a new beginning in America was not only possible, but achingly beautiful.